And joining me now, CBS News political director Steve Chaggaris. Why don't we kick it off with Senator Flake? I want to ask you, when he came into Congress in 2012, he had an approval rating, from the polls, 69%. He got him into office. His approval rating now hovers around 38%. What happened to Jeff Flake?
Well, I think a couple of things. First of all, Republicans in the state of Arizona aren't as big fans of him now as they were back then. Keep in mind, one of the first things he did when he became senator was get involved in coming up with a bipartisan immigration reform bill that was highly controversial among conservatives. And I think that there was some lingering sentiment or negative sentiment among Republican voters with his involvement in that. They don't want to see necessarily in Arizona immigration compromise. President Trump won in November. One of the reasons why is because he has a hard line on immigration. He won in Arizona in November, partially because of that, I think. And Flake sort of going there in terms of trying to come up with immigration reform might have been one thing that hurt. Even though he's a very conservative voter in the Senate, I think that was one issue. And he came across as a maverick, and I think conservatives in Arizona saw Flake as somebody who wasn't fully conservative enough for them. And so his approval ratings went down. He was facing a tough re-election battle. There was a candidate from the right who was supported by Steve Bannon, who used to work for President Trump, who was running against Flake in the primary next year. And there was going to be a serious challenge there. Bannon was going to dump a lot of money into that race to try to knock Flake off. And then, if he wound up winning in his August primary next year, he would face a tough Democrat in a state that Democrats have fared okay statewide. Generally, it's a Republican state, but it would have been a very expensive and tough primary for him. And you heard Flake say it yesterday. He said, if I wanted to win that primary, I'd have to say things and do things as a candidate that I don't necessarily agree with in order to win the primary. And he wasn't willing to sort of bend to the will of Trump voters and hardcore conservatives, really sort of, as he, I think, suggested, sell himself out to be somebody he wasn't in order to win that primary.
I'm wondering, Steve, if you've heard from people close to Steve Bannon. They had that win in Alabama. What are they saying about this? Is this a big victory lap for them?
It wasn't just a victory lap. I mean, I could basically, if they could have reached through the phone yesterday and high-fived me, that's how excited they were. No, it was amazing. I mean, they were celebrating. They're looking at the Alabama runoff. Their candidate won that a few weeks ago, and then Corker is somebody that they were targeting, and he's not running for re-election. And now Flake is somebody they're targeting, and he's now not running for re-election. So they feel that this is a huge success for them. They feel that their message of, if you're not on the Trump bandwagon, then get out, even if you're a Republican, is working. And they feel like they're, to use a term maybe they would use, purifying what they see the Republican Party should be moving forward. So there was a big celebration among the Bannon types yesterday.
You mentioned how Flake said that he wasn't ready, he didn't want to play the game to be able to get back into office. Other Republicans, he said, are quietly whispering similar things, that they're not happy with the president's actions. Do you think that Republicans who are up for re-election can be critical of the president at this point?
Well, we'll see. Keep in mind, this has been going on for a long time. This was going on during the presidential campaign last year, where there were whispers among a lot of Republican elected officials who weren't totally pleased with the president, but were willing to sort of clam up because they knew that there were people they needed to get Republican or at least Trump supporters out to the polls. That's partially some of the issue this year. Those Republicans who are up for re-election know that they need to get Republicans out to the polls in the midterms. Those Republicans that support the president, they need them out to vote for them. At the same time, they also have seen what happens when you go out publicly and criticize this president. Not only do you have the president come after you by tweeting and saying all sorts of negative things about you, but you have you wind up raising the wrath of Steve Bannon and perhaps donors and others who will fund challengers against you next time you're up for re-election. So there is a bit of self-preservation here among politicians, especially Republicans running for re-election. Do they want to make the road a little bit easier for themselves by working with this president and keeping people that are also in the Republican Party who are trying to keep them on board with Trump away from challenging them in primaries and in the general election next year? I think that's what you're seeing a lot of on Capitol Hill right now.
Steve, on the policy front, I want to ask you, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, released scores on the Alexander Murray, this bipartisan effort on health care, and it said that the government would save $3.8 billion over a decade. What's the read on Capitol Hill over these scores?
Well, I mean, I think the read on healthcare in general is sort of, it is what it is at this point. The focus right now on Capitol Hill for Republicans is getting tax reform done. Healthcare is sort of a sideshow for them at this point. I'm not sure this is something that's going to be coming to the forefront over the next several weeks. If you talk to any Republicans, whether they're elected officials, whether they're donors, whether they're strategists, the consensus among Republicans and the nerves that are being generated among Republicans are, if they don't pass tax reform by the end of this year, then this is going to seriously impact their success in the midterms next year and potentially jeopardize their majority in the House and Senate. You heard people like Ted Cruz a couple of weeks ago basically saying if they don't pass tax reform, they could have Watergate-type losses in the midterms next year. So it's all about tax reform right now. The House is trying to get something through and passed by the end of the month. By the end of November, and the Senate by the end of the year. And if they don't, there's going to be big worry. There already is big worry that they're not going to be able to do it.
Much to watch on Capitol Hill in the coming weeks and months. Our Steve Chaggaris, thank you for joining us.